Okay, folks, so we have arrived. It is that time. It is that time that you know is coming. Whenever you embark on a journey throughout theatrical history, you know that inevitably all points are going to lead you here. And this is kind of the pinnacle of theatrical history. Most historians will tell you there is everything that came before this and there's everything that came after, and that this is kind of the high point. This is where we have to talk about Shakespeare. And I know that the question that probably is jumping up into most people's minds when they hear this, especially for younger viewers, is why? Why do we have to talk about Shakespeare? Every theater professor, every English teacher, everybody goes on and on and on about how great Shakespeare was. Why do we have to listen? He wrote these long, confusing, wordy plays over 200 years ago. How does this have any relevance? Why are we talking about this guy? It's a natural question to ask. Everybody does at first. And unfortunately, there is no way to answer that without sounding like a theatrical sycophant. But the simple fact is, folks, is that Shakespeare's work was so, pardon me for using a cliche term, revolutionary. It truly was a turning point in the way plays were written, the way characters were written, the way shows were presented. It can't be overstated just how important his body of work is to the evolution of theater as an art form. On the surface, his plays appear to be fairly simplistic. They deal with big emotions, big concepts, revenge, anger, love, lust, comedy. These are the things designed to get the audience into the theater. Shakespeare's plays, believe it or not, are the Elizabethan equivalent to our modern day blockbusters. A online film critic recently compared the works of Shakespeare to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And believe it or not, there are similarities. In both cases, these franchises are designed to appeal to the widest number of people, again, by using these broad strokes, these big characters with big emotions. That's what hooks the audience. That's what gets them into the theater. But once they're in there, what we find when we actually go and we look at the words and we look at what is written is we find plays that for the first time aren't just dealing with big, larger-than-life issues. They are dealing with the human condition. Shakespeare's plays are some of the first to tackle concepts like racism, the inequality of the sexes, to command people to question their leaders. We see characters grappling with questions of faith, of morality, what is right and wrong, of mortality, what happens to us after we die. His work in the subtext lays the groundwork for modern day playwriting, modern day acting theory. It all starts here. This is why his plays are still talked about. This is why his plays are still performed. The universality of the concepts is what allows these plays to be taken out of the Elizabethan time period and produced in modern day New York. That and the fact that these plays are so old that nobody owns the copyrights on them, but that's a whole other story. That's the reason we go on and on about Shakespeare. That's the reason we make you read these long plays and see these traveling productions that come to your schools. Because, simply put, without Shakespeare, we probably wouldn't have plays in the same style that they are written today. We wouldn't have television shows written in the same styles. You like things like Game of Thrones? Big, broad worlds, but really subtle and well-written characters? Started here. But, and this is really important to understand, what really captivates most people about Shakespeare is not just the work, but the man himself. Shakespeare, the person, has generated just as much discussion and second guessing and theorizing as the dissection of his collected plays has. It seems like for every fact we have about Shakespeare, there are 15 facts that are missing. So we have, when we look at the life of Shakespeare, we see that we have pieces, but there are huge parts of the whole that are missing, and that has led to countless amounts of speculation and second guessing about who this man really was, what his life was really like, and in fact, if he even ever put pen to paper in the first place. So we're going to take a look at some of the facts that we know of, and also take a look at some of the questions and some of the mysteries surrounding the life and work of William Shakespeare. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start with his early life. We know that William Shakespeare was born April 26, 1564, and that he would die April 1616 on his birthday. So one heck of a birthday present there. We also know that he was born in a town called Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, the name Stratford-upon-Avon is taken from the fact that the town of Stratford is next to the Avon River, and a lot of towns and cities in England are identified by what body of water they are closest to, using the landmark as an easy means of identification. For centuries, and during the time that Shakespeare would have been living there, Stratford was a market town. Today, of course, it's more of a tourist attraction due to its connection to Shakespeare. The inconsistencies and mysteries surrounding Shakespeare begin almost immediately, and they start with his father, John Shakespeare. We know that John Shakespeare was a glover by trade, meaning that it was his job to make custom gloves. You couldn't just go and buy a set at the Walmart back then, so you had to have them custom made. We also know that he was a city alderman, meaning that he was a member of the city council. Aside from that, the financial status of John Shakespeare is a matter of a lot of debate. Some reports say that he was fairly well off and a respected businessman. Most others say that he was consistently in debt. Some reports say that he was the mayor of the town, others that he was a bailiff. Some said he was so poor that as a means of making money, he would allow farmers to dump their unused animal manure onto his lawn for a small fee. The best most historians can piece together is that he was a glover, he was an alderman, and that he had designs on becoming what we would call a gentleman, meaning he wanted to be part of the upper class, and that those attempts to gain access to that social status would lead him into greater and greater debt. But again, there's no way to really know any of this for sure. We know that the young William Shakespeare attended the local grammar school, which was known as the King's New School. It's actually still there in Stratford, and students still attend it. We also know that because of his father's position as an alderman, that he was allowed to attend at no fee. This is well before the concept of public education, when being able to educate your child was seen as a status symbol. So this would lend some credence to the theory that his father was really attempting to rise above his social station. The education at the King's New School was largely based on Latin grammar and literature. It's here that we believe Shakespeare was first introduced to drama, specifically the Latin comedies, which would have been part of the regular curriculum at the time. We know, as we look at some of Shakespeare's works, such as the Comedy of Errors, that he was highly influenced by Roman comedies and Greek tragedies. So we believe it is here that he was first introduced to those. So while we know that William Shakespeare attended the King's New School, what is up for debate is how long he was actually there. It's believed that he dropped out around the time he was 13. Some people believe that he dropped out when he was even younger. What we do know, or know as well as we think we can as it relates to things of this time period, and of Shakespeare specifically, is we know he never completed his education. As far as we are aware, he never went on to university. He never graduated from the King's New School. So there's a constant question mark over how educated William Shakespeare actually was. There is the first of many gaps in Shakespeare's life after he leaves the King's New School. There's no real documentation of him between 1578, which is when we believe he dropped out, and 1582. So nobody really knows what he was getting up to in those intervening years. Some say that he was apprenticing at various places, and some say he was just getting into various mischief. But the next form of documentation we have comes in November of 1582, when Shakespeare marries a woman named Anne Hathaway. And whoops, give me a second. There we go. Sorry about that. Anyway, we know that in November of 1582, Shakespeare married a woman named Anne Hathaway. At the time of their marriage, he was 18, she was 26. So that's quite an age gap, even for back then. It was not uncommon for older men to marry much younger women, but for an older woman, 26 is still fairly old at this time to be unmarried, and to marry a man that much younger is rather unusual. We also know that the couple's first child, Susanna, was baptized 6 months later in May of 1583, keeping in mind that children were baptized very quickly after birth back in those days because there was no guarantee the child was going to survive. So once again, Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway are married November of 1582. Their first child is born May of 1583, 6 months later. You do the math on that. One reason this is important to note is that we are seeing something of a pattern begin here with this little mathematical quandary. And that is, by a lot of accounts, Shakespeare was something of a rogue and something of a rascal and something of a ladies' man. So as stated, we know that William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway had their first child, Susanna, in 1583. They would follow that up in 1585 with their twins, Judith and Hamnet. Interesting name, isn't it? Hamnet. If you say it fast, it sounds a little bit like a rather famous literary character created by William Shakespeare himself. And historians believe that's no coincidence. Shakespeare's only son, Hamlet, would die at the age of 11. This, again, was not an uncommon thing in those days for children to die very, very young. And it's believed that the loss of his son would be the inspiration for the play Hamlet. As talked about in the introduction to this video, one of the reasons why we praise Shakespeare's work so much is that it is one of the first bodies of work that really starts to look inward and starts to examine the human condition from an internal perspective, as opposed to the external influencing everything. We start seeing how people's minds work psychologically. We begin to see his characters question the world around them and question their place in it. This is something that had not been done before. If we look at the play Hamlet, some things that we notice: it has unusually heavy subject matter. One of the recurring themes of Hamlet is the questioning of life and death. Multiple times in this play, Hamlet asks the question, where do we go? What happens to us? What happens to our being, our spirit, our knowledge? What becomes of everything that we are? Our life, our love, our experiences, our thoughts and our memories, the joy and the anger that we brought to the people in our lives. What happens to that after we die? This is not a question that had ever really been pondered before in a theatrical setting. More than that, we see that he questions moral choices. Do moral choices matter? Do the things we do here on earth even have a significance after we're gone? These are all questions that psychologists and therapists have said that people who have lost loved ones, people who have lost especially children, tend to spend a lot of their time pondering. Beyond that, these are just questions that human beings themselves often ponder. So we see the influence of the man's life in the work that he would go on to produce. It's also believed that the loss of his child didn't just influence his tragedies, but also found its way into his comedies. Several of his most well-known and beloved comedies, including The Twelfth Night and The Comedy of Errors, feature twins who are separated, but then find a way to happily reunite. Especially in Twelfth Night, you have a male and a female twin that are separated. The male twin is believed dead, but is then able to reunite with his sibling at the end of the play. So once again, we see something that playwrights to this day use their work for: wish fulfillment, trying to find a happy ending to a real-life tragic event. So in 1585, we know that Shakespeare leaves Stratford-upon-Avon. The circumstances surrounding his decision to pick up, leave his town, leave his wife and children behind, and venture out are a source of great debate among historians. Key thing with Shakespeare, you talk to 4 different people about him, you read 4 different books, you look at 4 different websites, you're going to come up with 4 different answers, each person claiming this is the right one, when in fact we just don't know. We don't know why he suddenly left. There are a number of theories. There is the theory that he was caught poaching a deer and he ran away in order to avoid punishment. There is the simple theory that he left to go to London so that he could find more employment and therefore provide for his family. That was not an uncommon thing back then. There is the theory that he and Anne Hathaway no longer loved each other and he got up and just left her, with divorce not being available at that time, or divorced people being looked down on that time. They stayed married, but he just kind of up and left. There is the theory that his father was engaged in a very heated lawsuit against his uncle, and in the process of that lawsuit, a number of land and holdings that the Shakespeare family had were lost. So now what would have been William Shakespeare's inheritance was either completely decimated or dwindled down to basically nothing, so he went off to try to find more fortune. Whatever theory you go with, the simple fact is he leaves. He leaves his wife and children, and ventures out. And we will not see any sign of him in terms of official records or documentation for 7 years. Nobody knows what Shakespeare was doing during that 7-year period. Again, a lot of these theories as to why he left involve him, well, he's going to go to London and make more money. Fair enough, but even back then it wouldn't take you 7 years to get to London from Stratford-upon-Avon. So what happened to William Shakespeare in those intervening years? Nobody really knows, and again, there are no shortage of theories that people have about what was going on with the young man as he journeyed from his home. We do know that once he establishes himself in London, that he does start to buy up land and holdings in Stratford again. When he finally returns towards the end of his life and once again lives with Anne Hathaway, he has much stronger holdings in the town than he had before he left. So take that for whatever you want to take it for. Simple fact is, for 7 years, this man disappears and nobody knows for sure what was going on with him at that time. But when he finally does reappear in London, in the theater scene, he is about to make a huge splash and rewrite the rule book as to how plays are written and how characters are presented. We're going to talk about some of his plays, we're going to talk about his writing style, and we are going to talk about the impact of his productions next time.